Hey everybody, this is the second chapter from Charul Bettelheim's class struggle in the USSR, um, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. There we go. According to the official description, Soviet agriculture in the late 1930s comprised essentially three types of, quote, socialist production units: sovkhozes or state farms, MTS, machine and tractor stations, and kolkhozes or, quote, collective farms. The first two forms of agricultural activity were supposed to have a, quote, superior character compared with the kolkhozes because they were directly tied with the state. Footnote: the division of the rural population between these different forms of agricultural activity has been dealt with above. And footnote: this categorization does not tell us much about the real social relationships in which the direct producers were placed. Nevertheless, it permits a distinction between the wage earners of the sovkhozes and the machine and tractor stations, who were in a situation similar to that of industrial workers. See Part 2 of this volume, and the kolkhozniks. The situation of these latter requires a specific analysis, which brings into discussion a kolkhoz system whose reality may be contrasted with the fiction of official announcements. This contrast needs to be clarified before proceeding to an analysis in greater detail of the economic effects of the, quote, socialization of agriculture and of its consequences for class relationships. Section 1. The kolkhoz as fiction and as reality. Official discussion repeated endlessly the image of a certain, quote, fictitious kolkhoz, unquote, and this fiction developed in the areas of politics, law, and economics, to say nothing of art, with films and novels conforming to the standards of, quote, socialist realism. In this fiction, the kolkhoz was the result of a policy of, quote, voluntary membership on the part of the peasants who, with the, quote, help of the state, spontaneously and en masse entered the path of collective agriculture. Related to this, there's a film titled Earth that was from the period of collectivization, of Stalin's collectivization, about a fictitious collective farm in the Ukraine. And it's obviously a propaganda film, but it's really a tremendous and interesting watch. And this is 100% the narrative of that film, that collective farms were about communities coming together, in a spirit of mutual aid and socialist construction. Anyway, from this there resulted the birth of, quote, socialist cooperatives, which had the juridical form of the, quote, artel, parenthesis, one of the traditional Russian forms of production cooperation, end parenthesis. The latter had at its collective disposition, quote, agricultural equipment, livestock, seed stocks, forage for the collective livestock, and the working premises needed for the proper operation of the collective husbandry, end quote. Its management was entrusted to the General Assembly of the kolkhozniks, while the central administration was entrusted to an elected chairman and controlled by the same General Assembly. For the principal cropping operations, the kolkhozes benefited from the cooperation of the machine and tractor stations, in which was concentrated the main agricultural equipment. The incomes collected by the kolkhozniks by virtue of, quote, collective exploitation depended solely on their labor. From 1937, the party, press, Soviet films, etc. proclaimed the, quote, brilliant victory of socialism, end quote, in agriculture, the increase of the harvest gathered from land generously provided with tractors and agricultural machines, and with the field workers enjoying an unprecedented prosperity. Footnote. See, for example, the description of the Soviet agricultural situation in 1937 in the History of the Communist Party of the USSR, B. End footnote. The reality is quite different and much more complicated. We already know what, quote, voluntary adhesion of the peasants to the collective farms really means, and we know about the repression which battered the peasants during the course of collectivization and afterward, aiming to subject the peasants to the, quote, discipline that the system required. However, to grasp the reality of, quote, socialist agriculture, something must be said about the economic effects of the, quote, socialist transformation, end quote, of the countryside, and of the, quote, socialist transformations, end quote, impact on the living conditions of the rural masses, and also something about the internal social relationships of the kolkhoz and its subordination to the demands of accumulation by the state. It is only after doing all this that one can attempt to describe the, quote, kolkhoz system and the role which it filled in the total picture of economic and social relationships that developed during the 1930s. New section. Section 2. The economic effects of the, quote, socialization of agriculture. The economic effects of the, quote, socialization of agriculture can be studied at different levels. Here, we shall mainly limit ourselves to data relating to production. The quote is placed on agriculture, for the latter were made possible by the new agrarian structures, and the figures relating to the living conditions of the kolkhozniks, who henceforth represented the great mass of rural workers. New section. A. The crisis in agricultural production and stock breeding. The transformation of agrarian structures did not bring about the vast increase of harvests and livestock which the party had expected. On the contrary, it was accompanied universally by a crisis in agricultural production. This crisis, which ended not in the 1930s but continued rather longer, did not affect different types of agricultural production in the same way. Certain branches, particularly lucky, were even untouched, but it struck the essential branches and especially the all-important grain production. Given the decisive role of grain production, we must give some indications of grain production's development during the 1930s. These figures cover all forms of agriculture, both, quote, socialized and non-socialized. Footnote. In the following pages, reference will be made primarily to physical unit statistics, which are more, quote, reliable than those based on prices. Special use will be made of recent statistics. In fact, the latter show that some of the pre-war statistics partly obscured the depth of the catastrophe that, quote, collectivization from above heaped on agricultural production. However, even recent statistics, when they are in terms of, quote, value, that is, of allegedly constant, quote, prices, continue to hide the scale of the disaster. End footnote. Footnote. As time passed, the agricultural crisis became more fully that of, quote, socialized agriculture, properly described. Thus, in 1940, the kolkhozes and sovkhozes disposed respectively of 81.3 and 8.8% of the sown area, which had grown to 150.4 million hectares, compared to 113 million in 1928. End footnote. In 1930, the year when sowing took place after the, quote, pressure for collectivization was relaxed, the gross grain harvest rose to 77.1 million tons. Footnote. This figure is given by Moshe Lewin in the article Taking Grain, Soviet Policies of Agricultural Procurements Before the War, a contribution to S. Abransky's edited volume Essays in Honor of E. H. Carr, published in 1974. This is a minimal estimate. The most often quoted figure is, in fact, 83.5 million tons. After that date, end footnote, after that date, The harvest collapsed in an almost continuous curve up to the middle of the 1930s. The worst harvest was that of 1936. The following table can be composed. So, in 1930, there was 77 million tons of grain. In 1936, there was 56 million tons of grain. In 1937, there was 87 million tons of grain. In 1938, there was 67 tons of grain. In 1939, there was 67 million tons of grain. The, quote, collectivization from above, which is intended to achieve a, quote, leap forward in the grain production of the USSR, therefore did nothing to enable the hoped-for results to be obtained. Quite the contrary. For other food crops, the development of the situation was a little less bad, but was far from compensating for the grain crisis. Footnote. These figures are from the following, the figures that I just read earlier, from the chart. These figures are from the following sources. For 1930 and 1939, see preceding note. For 1936, the Soviet statistics covering the grain harvest are extremely confused. The Soviet statistics covering the grain harvest, the 1936 grain harvest, had a catastrophic situation. The figure of 56.1 million tons is an optimistic estimate. It has been calculated from the difference between the average productions officially announced for 1933 and 1937, 72.9 million tons. And for the productions of 1933, 1934, 1935, and 1937, see Alec Nova, An Economic History of the Soviet Union. And it has a quote from something in Russian that I can't read. End footnote. Livestock production also went in deep decline. The index for this production, 100 in 1913, had reached 137 in 1928 and 129 in 1929. It fell to 65 in 1933 and recovered only to 120 and 114 in 1938 and 1940 respectively. The drop in annual production was at first a result of the mass slaughter of livestock, in which almost all of the peasants indulged between 1928 and 1930, procurements and collectivization from above being regarded as virtual expropriation. The destruction of livestock continued up to 1933, taking just the figures for the bovine population. The bovine population fell from 70.5 million in 1928 to 52.5 million in 1930. It reached a trough in 1933, 38.4 million, and then recovered slightly in 1934, 42.4 millions. In 1938, this figure was still only 50.9 million, very much below that of 1928. The latter figure would only be regained well after the war. The situation was no better for other livestock raising. The reduction of the number of cows implied a reduction in the available tractive force, which was all the more serious because the number of horses fell equally, dropping from 38.4 million head in 1928 to 17 or 18 million at the end of the 1930s. Footnote, see Charles Bettelheim, L'économie soviétique, published in 1950, where Soviet pre-war sources are indicated. End footnote. The reduction of livestock had unfavorable repercussions on the amount of natural fertilizer available for agriculture. The fall in livestock was quite rapidly compensated by the investment effort made in means of production, originating from industry, means which replaced what had been destroyed. For example, for 1935, the tractive power available to agriculture slightly exceeded, thanks to mechanization, that of 1928, and this improvement continued after 1935. In the same way, the production of mineral fertilizers rose quite considerably in the second half of the 1930s. The increase in the material factors of production, put at the disposition of the countryside, was not enough to prevent the agricultural crisis continuing in the second half of the 1930s. Essentially, the decisive factor in this crisis was the human factor, the peasant resistance to, quote, collectivization and to compulsory procurement, the revolt against production relationships and impositions, which the peasant masses did not accept. This revolt manifested itself in particular by the tendency to work relatively little on the, quote, collective land and carry out negligently the required tasks. Footnote. It was to combat this type of resistance that complex forms of, quote, work remuneration, end quote, in colchozes were put into effect during the 1930s. End footnote. The resistance, at first active and then above all passive, was accompanied by a reduction of the standard of living in the countryside. The effects of the resistance were aggravated by the physical enfeeblement of the peasantry, which is undernourished, abandoned to famine, and from which were, quote, commandeered, end quote, millions of men in their prime, either to go to work, quote, voluntarily in industry, hoping to increase their incomes, or to be deported into inhospitable regions, where most often they were used in the timber industry, the mines, and on big construction sites. In March 1931, at the 11th Congress of Soviets, Yakovlev described the behavior of the kolkhozniks in the light of frequent observations. According to Yakovlev, the kolkhozniks got up late, 8 o'clock in the morning, even in peak periods, then chatted with their neighbors without hurrying. Just when they were ready to leave for fields, the time came for the peasant, quote, breakfast. One second. Yeah, I can't find the Yakovlev. I was seeing if I could find Yakovlev, but I can't find him. During working hours, work was done negligently, plowing was done hurriedly, and left the soil in a bad state. Sowing also took place hastily. At harvest time, the grain was so badly loaded, the grain fell from the carts and stayed mixed up in the straw. Footnote. See something in Russian quoted from January 16th, 1931, quoted by R.W. Davies in The Industrialization of Soviet Russia, Volume 2, The Soviet Collective Farm, 1929 to 1930, published in 1979. End footnote. The resistance deeply disturbed the working of, quote, collective agriculture. It explains why the investment made by the state to increase agricultural production led to such derisory results. The seriousness of the agricultural crisis following, quote, collectivization from above does not justify the conclusion that the latter was, quote, mistaken, for such a conclusion would evade the class logic which had inspired collectivization. In fact, from the authorities' point of view, the, quote, socialization of agriculture was the one way leading to the consolidation of their grip on society, by reducing to a minimum, by the use of violence, by famine, and by the disorganization of peasantry, the capacity for organized resistance by the peasants to the demands of accumulation. It made it possible to very much increase the appropriations made from agriculture. New heading B, appropriations made from agriculture. Numerous attempts have been made to, quote, measure the growth of the appropriations made from agriculture during the 1930s, and even to, quote, make a balance sheet by putting a value to the net effect, positive or negative, of these exactions on the resources of state and industry. These evaluations have provoked many controversies. Footnote. Here are the sources of some of these estimates and some writings which enter into the controversies aroused by these estimates. Something by an A.A. Barsov, published in 1969, and this author's article devoted to the sources of, quote, socialist accumulation during the 5-year plan, published in 1968. See Isaac Deutscher's Stalin, 1968, J.F. Kars's article From Stalin to Brezhnev's Soviet Agricultural Policy and Historical Perspective, published in J.R. Millar, The Soviet Rural Community. See Alec Nova, An Economic History of the USSR. See A. Ehrlich, The Soviet Industrialization Debate, 1924 to 1928. The article by J.R. Millar titled Mass Collectivization and the Contribution of Soviet Agriculture to the First 5-Year Plan, a review article, published in Slavic Review, December 1974. End footnote. However interesting they may be, these discussions do not seem capable of resulting in global quantitative conclusions. In fact, collectivization and mass repression led above all to qualitative changes, to an upheaval in social relationships which subjected the countryside to the requirements of the authorities. Henceforth, the countryside was open to extortion, and the exactions made from the peasant's production and income and from the peasant population itself were various. An increase of procurement, the imposition of taxes in kind to pay for the use of agricultural machinery, concentrated in the machine and tractor stations, taxes, the development of, quote, scissors between industrial and agricultural prices, which went against the peasants, the compulsory contribution by kolkhozniks to the establishment of the, quote, productive funds of the kolkhozniks, of the kolkhozes, etc. These exactions revealed only certain aspects of the pillage of the countryside. Another aspect, more important, would appear later, namely the drawing off of part of the peasant labor force toward industry and the mines. The drawing off of part of the peasant labor force toward industry and the mines, either as, quote, free workers or as forced labor. In the one case, this drawing off took the form of an urbanization and industrialization process. In the other, it took the form of deportations whose scale is not, as we have seen, easily translated into figures. New section. For the moment, we will look at some of the forms of exaction which are relatively better known. 1. The increase in the quantity of agricultural products appropriated in the countryside. The appropriation that the state made from agricultural production moved through several channels. Quote, purchases of products. Quote, obligatory deliveries. Bracket, for which the price was even less than for, quote, purchased products and lacking any pretense of, quote, sales contracts, end quote, end bracket. Requisitions, confiscations, taxes in kind, payment in kind for, quote, services rendered by the machine and tractor stations, etc. Footnote, these, quote, purchases most often were only the form by which the peasants end quote, causes were obliged to transfer part of their production to state organs at a, quote, price fixed by the latter, and which could be derisory to the point where it could not even cover production costs. End footnote. We will therefore generalize all these exactions under the term, quote, procurements, and then give some indications about the actual conditions in which the procurements were achieved. We will concentrate our attention on the procurement of grain, which had decisive economic and social importance. The official figures covering the harvest and the procurement of grain do not always agree. We regard as particularly significant those quoted by Moshe Lewin in his contribution to essays in honor of E.H. Carr. For several key years, the figures are as follows. In 1928, there was 73.3 million tons of grain harvested. 10.7 was procured. Balance gross 62.6, million tons. 1930, 77.1 million tons. 22.1 million tons were procured, and there was a 55 million ton balance. In 1931, there was a 69.4 million tons of grain harvested, 22.8 million tons of grain procured, and 46.6 gross balance. In 1935, there was 62.4 million tons of grain harvested, 28.3 million tons procured, 34.1 gross balance. In 1939, there was 67.3 million tons of grain harvested, 32.1 procurement, 35.2 million tons gross balance. The figures quoted, which are confirmed by numerous other sources, indicate that the reduction of the gross balance remaining is an almost continuous curve until the mid-1930s. At that period, the gross balance left in the countryside was no more than 54% of that in 1928. Between 1935 and 1939, the balance rose only by 0.9 million tons, while production increased 4.9 million. This increase, therefore, was hardly a, quote, paying proposition for the peasantry. The quantities of grain which the villages had at the village's effective disposition did not fall quite at the same speed. In fact, grain was resold by the state to the villagers, either in the, quote, traditionally deficit regions or in certain cases of famine. These sales were generally made at a price greater than the buying price of these same cereals by the state in the form of procurements. In any case, in the years 1932 to 34, the amounts were sold to the countryside were very much less than needs, which exacerbated the famine from which the peasantry was at that time suffering. When one takes into account the resales, which is not always possible, the, quote, net balance available to the village, end quote, may be obtained. During the first 5-year plan, the latter fell drastically from approximately 65 million tons to 50.6 million between 1928 and 1929 and 1931 and 1932. Footnote: these figures are calculated by combining the data for harvest figuring in the preceding table with estimates of the, quote, village net sales, end quote, given by J.F. Kars in his contribution to the Soviet Rural Community, the book. End footnote. This meant famine conditions given the need for grain used for sowing and for livestock feed, even if the massive reduction of livestock tended to somewhat reduce the need for grain in the countryside, a circumstance which, quote, helped to increase the grain procurements. During the 1930s, the state also very much increased the exactions which the state made on agricultural products other than grain. The overall result of the policy which was followed was a substantial fall of consumption of most agricultural foodstuffs in the countryside. The overall result of the policy which was followed was a substantial fall of consumption of most agricultural foodstuffs in the countryside. This fall was not in reality compensated by an increase in the supplies and payments which came to the peasants. On the contrary, there was a serious deterioration in the terms of exchange. A serious deterioration in the terms of exchange between the state and countryside, hence the overall negative effect for the peasantry of the increased exactions made on agricultural production. The shortcomings of the available statistics allow us to grasp only some aspects of the development of the terms of exchange between the state and peasants, and notably the monetary and financial aspect. Two, the terms of exchange between state and peasantry. The state peasantry terms of exchange varied considerably during the 1930s. The following points involve above all the kolkhoz peasantry, which soon represented the majority of peasants. During the first 5-year plan, exchanges between the peasants and, quote, towns, which essentially meant the state procurement organizations, were in principle always regulated by the contractatia, by virtue of which the peasants, quote, promised, bracket, in fact, the, quote, promise was made by administrative cadres who spoke in the peasant's name, end bracket, to deliver predetermined quantities of products to the state. In return, the state was to provide predetermined amounts of industrial products. In reality, the system did not operate as it should have done. On the one hand, the state organizations were not capable of meeting the supply obligations for the benefit of the peasants. On the other hand, the procurement organizations often demanded deliveries larger than those laid down in the contractatia. This situation resulted from a policy which itself was a consequence of the class offensive conducted against the peasantry with a view to maximizing accumulation by the state. The statistics allow an evaluation, very approximate, of the, quote, balance by value, end quote, of these exchanges. Thus, between 1929 and 1931, bracket, when the amounts of agricultural products procured by the state increased massively, end bracket, the volume of deliveries of industrial products for consumption by the agricultural population fell by 10%. It fell by about another 25% between 1930 and 1932. Footnote: these percentages are calculated from Barsov's data, taking into account the alterations made by J.F. Kars in the book The Soviet Rural Communes. End footnote. These figures underestimate, moreover, the drop in the supply of the peasants, the drop in the supply to the peasants of industrial consumer goods, for these figures take no account of the disappearance of the rural artisans who, up to the end of the NEP, provided a substantial part of the products needed by the peasants. These figures underestimate, moreover, the drop in the supply of the peasants of industrial consumer goods, for they take no account of the disappearance of the rural artisans, who up to the end of NEP provided a substantial part of the products needed by the peasants. Although the peasantry delivered more and more products and received less and less, the peasantry's monetary resources diminished. because the, quote, prices which the state organs paid the peasantry remained more or less stationary. Bracket, they even fell in 1932 and increased only slightly afterwards, end bracket. While the prices at which peasants bought industrial products from the state Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. While the prices at which the peasants bought industrial products from the state increased substantially. Footnote. Between 1928 and 1931, the prices that the state paid for agricultural products delivered as the planned procurement passed from an index of 100 to 118.6 before falling back to 109.3 in 1932. Meantime, the index of prices at which the state sold industrial consumer products moved from 100 to 180.1 in 1931 and to 284.5 in 1932. See J.F. Cars's The Soviet Rural Commune. End footnote. In 1931, measures were taken to increase the monetary resources of the peasantry. They consisted mainly in authorizing peasants and kolkhozniks to sell directly a part of the peasant and kolkhozniks' production, bracket, which for the kolkhozniks came from their plots and from their, quote, individual livestock, end bracket, to consumers, and at, quote, free prices, which were clearly higher than those paid by the state. In October 1931, the kolkhozes and the sovkhozes were similarly authorized to make such sales, so long as they had fulfilled animal products. But the price at which peasants bought industrial products increased substantially. For example, the price of cotton goods increased by 8 times between 1928 and 1937. Fuck, there's pages missing. Wait. Fuck. God, that's annoying. Sorry about that. That's super annoying. I'll have to put that in the description. In sum, after the beginning of the 1930s, there was a serious... Actually, I'm going to pause this and see if I can find a better PDF of this. Okay, so I skipped, I downloaded another version of this book, and it seems like this version also skips pages. So I'll finish reading the last paragraph of page 37. In 1931, measures were taken to increase the monetary resources of the peasantry. They consisted mainly in authorizing peasants and kolkhozniks to sell directly a part of their production, which for the kolkhozniks came from their plots and from their, quote, individual livestock, to consumers, and at, quote, free prices, which were clearly higher than those paid by the state. In October 1931, the kolkhozes and the sovkhozes were similarly authorized to make such sales, so long as they had fulfilled animal products. As long as they had fulfilled, and then the page skips. And then it starts, animal products. But the price at which peasants bought industrial products increased substantially. For example, the price of cotton goods increased by 8 times between 1928 and 1937. Footnote. Alec Nova. See above, page 243. See also the table on page 85 of the November/December issue of Économie et Politique, 1957. In addition, it would be noted that the prices at which the peasants and kolkhozes sold their produce on the free market, which had been multiplied by 30 between 1928 and 1932, the amount offered being then minimal, fell by more than a half between 1933 and 1937, and from 1937 to 1940, the evolution of prices of sale and purchase did not improve the lot of the kolkhoz peasantry, quite the contrary. In fact, see J. Millar's edited volume, The Soviet Rural Community. End footnote. In sum, after the beginning of the 1930s, there was a serious exacerbation of the living conditions of the peasants, thanks to the direct exploitation of forced labor on the, quote, collective land, and to indirect exploitation exercised through exchange and price movements. The intensified exploitation of the peasantry entailed a series of consequences. It kept at a very low level the incomes that the members of agricultural artels drew from their labor within the latter. Footnote. This question will be dealt with later. End footnote. In 1931, where am I? Closely related to this, it had the effect of allocating a decisive role to the economic activities of the family in production. Closely related to this, it had the effect of allocating a decisive role to the economic activities of the family in production. Such family activities in no way had an, quote, auxiliary, in quote, nature, as kolkhoz fiction claims, because it was indispensable for the existence of the kolkhoz system. 4. Observations about the financial contribution of agriculture to accumulation by the state. The indirect forms of exploitation of the peasants allowed the state to draw from agriculture a, quote, financial contribution and accumulate much more than would appear at first sight. This emerges not only from the relative development of prices for agricultural and industrial products, but also from an examination of the fiscal mechanisms which underlay this development during the 1930s. Agriculture therefore played a considerable role in the indirect, quote, financing of state accumulation. Footnote. This would not be apparent if only direct taxation of agriculture was examined, that is, the product of the agricultural tax. For example, in 1937, this tax, then fixed by the net income of farms, provided only 1% of budgetary receipts. This percentage is calculated from Soviet sources in Charles Bettelheim, La Planification Soviétique, pages 175 and 271. End footnote. In fact, in the state budget, through which pass the main monetary flows which, quote, finance state accumulation, first place was occupied in the receipts column by the turnover tax. In 1937, for example, this tax produced 75% of the budget receipts, and it affected essentially agricultural products, including those of the food industry. The rate at which these products were taxed was particularly high, 33 to 65% of the selling price for vegetable oils, from 37 to 87% of the selling price for meat, but the largest part of the fiscal receipts coming from agricultural products, 66% of these receipts, related to taxes on bread and bakery products. Footnote: the size of the commercial receipts and fiscal receipts obtained by the state through the products extorted, but practically nothing from the peasantry, was considerable. Thus, in 1933 to 34, the price at which the state bought wheat from the grain areas was from 8.2 to 9.4 kopecks per kilo, while wheat flour was sold in state shops for 35 to 60 kopecks against ration coupons, and from 4 to 5 rubles off ration. For potatoes, the prices were as follows: purchased at 3 to 4 kopecks, sold as rations at 20 to 30 kopecks, sold off rations at 1.2 to 2 rubles. See R. Medvedev, Let History Judge, page 92. End footnote. Finally, bearing in mind the fall in essential agricultural production, the new relationships of domination and exploitation to which the peasants were subjected, and the concrete and indirect forms in which this exploitation was clothed, it can be seen that collectivization had catastrophic effects for the great mass of the peasantry. The low standard of life of the kolkhozniks is a consequence of the course followed by the agricultural production and the exaction to which it was subject. Nevertheless, this low standard of living also resulted from the very working of the kolkhoz system. That's the end of the chapter. I apologize for the missing pages, but bear with me. Or thank you for bearing with me.